Well, it's great being with all of you here at End Times with Pastor Eric. Today we're going to be helping you interpret the Olivet Discourse, and I'm going to help you understand here really the lengthiest discourse of eschatology in the Gospels, that is the Olivet Discourse found in Matthew chapter 24. So we got a lot to cover. If you have not seen the previous message I did on Matthew 23, setting the context, please look at that at some time. It really helps you understand and interpret Matthew 24 if you realize the setting and the significance of Jesus coming out of the temple in Matthew chapter 23. Now let's begin today by talking about Matthew's chiasm. A chiasm is an inverted parallelism, and it's a structure that many of the biblical writers used to focus their thoughts and to really show us indeed what God has said. Now what I want to do is show you the question that Jesus' disciples had answered as he was with them on the Mount of Olives. Notice here Matthew 24:3, it says, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Recall, Jesus had foretold of the destruction of the temple, and because they're on the Mount of Olives, the disciples assumed this would happen at the final battle referred to in Zechariah chapter 14. Recall, in that battle, the nations will surround Jerusalem. Half of the city will basically be ransacked, and they are assuming that this is going to occur then. At that time, the Messiah will intervene. We know that that is the future 70th week of Daniel, the final battle in the 70th week of Daniel. So notice the question. I'll pull up my pointer. They asked, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? The term coming there is parousia. They obviously believe that that would be synonymous with the end of the age. Why? Because when the Messiah came, that would be the end of the age as we know it, where human beings ruled over the earth that were sinful. Instead, Jesus Christ would bodily reign from Jerusalem, a restored kingdom over Israel. And as it says in Isaiah 2, there'd be swords beat into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks, and no longer will the nations learn war. Obviously, that is not yet occurring. We have just witnessed the invasion by Hamas of Israel, and certainly the world is not living in peace. Therefore, those who claim, who are amillennialists, that we are living in the kingdom, they have a deficient kingdom. Okay? Now, again, two questions. When will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your parousia? Those are the two. Again, the end of the age is synonymous with his coming. Okay, so how did this work out? Well, the first question, when will these things happen? Again, I'm taking that right from here. Everyone see that? I have them color-coded. That's the first question of the disciples. The second question, what will be the sign of your coming? That's parousia. Okay, that's their second question, taken right from here. Jesus answers them in reverse order. Sometimes you'll see politicians do that. They'll be asked two questions by a reporter. They'll say, let me handle the second question first. Well, that's exactly what Jesus does. He answers the what question from Matthew 24:4 all the way to verse 35. Jesus is answering the second question about signs. All of the signs that you'll find in the Olivet Discourse are in this section. And they all, as you will find out, are within the 70th week of Daniel. There is not one sign that Jesus gives us that is to be seen outside of the 70th week of Daniel. And I'll explain later why that is. Now, Jesus will answer the first question last from Matthew 24:36 through 51. He answers the first question, when. So if you think about it, when Jesus answers the second question, and he puts all the signs from verses 4 to 35, he is inside the 70th week. All of a sudden in Matthew 24:36 through 51, Jesus is talking about the beginning of the future 70th week of Daniel. And that's why he says 4 or 5 different ways you can't know. No one knows the day or the hour, not even the angels of heaven. This is also why the rapture is alluded to in this section and referred to in Matthew 24 verses 40 through 41. It's likened to the days of Noah in its suddenness. Remember, there will be 2 men in a field, one will be taken, one will be left. That's here. Why? Because Matthew has Jesus talking about the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. Brothers and sisters, what I'm claiming is if you don't see this chiastic structure, then you'll never understand the Olivet Discourse properly. I know that's bold. It seems arrogant. I'll prove it to you. The way we know this is true is through 2 reasons. Number 1, there's a discourse marker in verse 36 called peri. Peri is a preposition and a conjunction put together that functions as a discourse marker. When I was in seminary, I was blessed to sit under a theologian who did his PhD dissertation in Hebrew discourse markers. And in discourse grammar, what you're looking for is structure. You want to see clues that give you understanding as to when the biblical author is changing subjects. So the same is true not just in Hebrew, but also in Greek. In Greek, if you read the original, well, we don't have the original manuscripts, but if you read the papyri and some of these uncials and all these things, you'll see that all of the words are basically run-on sentences. In other words, there's no paragraph breaks. So how did the biblical writers formulate a paragraph break or a subject change? They use discourse markers like peri. Peri is best rendered now concerning, and it shows a change in topic. What that's showing us here is Jesus has changed the topic from verses 4 through 35, where he was answering about the signs inside the 70th week. Now he's answering the first question, when will the 70th week come? Again, the hint is the discourse marker at the very beginning of verse 36, peri, and it's rendered now concerning. If you don't want to believe me, let us look to the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology. Okay, it's a 4-volume set, and in volume 3, the scholar R.K. Harrison says this about peri. I'll read you right from the source. This is page 1203, and they say peri, quote, marks a new section of thought, a point of importance for the reconstruction, for example, of the Corinthian letter in Paul's answers in 1 Corinthians 7 through 25. It is also partially, well, it goes on to say, well, anyway, my point in saying these things to you from this dictionary is to show you that this is widely regarded by scholarship today as the beginning of a new paragraph. That's the point. Okay, so we have that. Now, if that weren't enough, we also have context. There are no signs in verses 36 through 51, not one. Not one. There's not one sign. Where you have many, many, many signs in verses 4 through 35, as I'm going to show you. Okay? So as I build the case that this is the correct structure, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to handle the discourse marker, and then I'm going to look at the context with you. Okay? So let's begin looking at peri, and I'm going to show you that indeed in the Bible it is always used for a topic change. Why is that important? Because it shows you at verse 36, Jesus is changing topics, talking about what the signs were previously to when the 70th week will come. Okay, again, Matthew 24:4, all the way to verse 35, he's talking about signs inside the 70th week. Okay, Matthew 24:36, all the way to verse 51 at the end of the chapter, he's talking about when does the 70th week come, and we can't know. What's the proof that that's indeed correct? Well, the discourse marker, peri. It's used, for example, in 1 Corinthians 7:1. Notice the now concerning, that's peri. And it's rendered in the New American Standard Bible here, now concerning. Now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. So notice here Paul is handling different topics that those at Corinth had asked him about. Okay, and he shows that he's handling a different topic now regarding remaining sexually celibate. Okay, now later on here, just 24 verses later, he uses it again. 1 Corinthians 7:25, peri, now concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord, but I give an opinion as one who by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy. So again, he's handling different subjects that were issues between a letter that Paul had with the Corinthians that we no longer have. And so he's addressing them, peri, now concerning this issue, peri, now concerning this issue. That's how it functions. Now, it's not just in 1 Corinthians. We see it in 1 Thessalonians 5:1 through 2. Very interestingly, prior to this now concerning, remember, you just came out of the rapture in 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 15 through 18. Now remember, originally there was no paragraphs, or I should say there was no verse numbers or chapter numbers, right? Those were added centuries later. So I want you to think about 3 verses prior to this, Paul is talking about the rapture. He's using harpazo. And in verse 18 of 1 Thessalonians 4, he says, therefore comfort one another with these words. Well, then immediately after talking about the rapture, what does he say? He says, peri, now concerning the times and the epochs, brethren, you have no need of anything to be written to you, For you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. Well, very interestingly, Jesus parousia in Matthew 24:36 through 51, again, that's synonymous with the 70th week of Daniel. That comes like a thief. So isn't it interesting? Paul understood the day of the Lord to be coming like a thief, and the day of the Lord following what? The rapture. Where does the wrath of God happen? It happens inside the day of the Lord. What has God promised us? That we will be exempt from his wrath. 7 verses after Paul talks about the day of the Lord and its coming wrath, he talks about you and I being exempt. He says, we have not been destined to wrath, but to obtain salvation through Jesus Christ our Lord. Now again, for our purposes though, notice the switch of topics. Now concerning, now concerning, now concerning, peri day, peri day, peri day. That's how it's used. And it's shocking that many people that teach prophecy online and YouTube never mention this fact. In fact, I would challenge any of you, go and look where peri day is mentioned by prophecy teachers out there. It's shocking. One of the roles of scholarship for those of us that have been to seminary, who've learned the languages and have some familiarity with the languages and the grammar and the syntax, is we should be pointing these things out to the people of God. Okay, now let me show you Matthew 22:31. I'm going to get to the author, Matthew himself. Notice he says, this is his debate with the Sadducees, peri day, now concerning the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God? Okay, so notice here, Matthew is showing us Jesus changing a subject and emphasizing now the resurrection of the dead. Okay, and by the way, when I mentioned peri day, this now concerning, one thing you need to realize is it doesn't mean that the writer, the biblical writer, whether it be Paul or Matthew, is saying now that's a completely different subject matter, completely unrelated to what was written before. No, sometimes it's related, but it's a different emphasis. And that's exactly what we have in the Olivet Discourse. When we come to Matthew 24:36, Paul has just given you all the signs inside the 70th week all the way up to verse 35. Verses 32 through 35 are really kind of a summary, and I'll explain that today. Well, all of a sudden to verse 36, he's going to answer now the first question. When will these things be? And that's how he says it, peri day, now concerning the day and the hour. Here the day represents the day of the Lord and the hour of trial. The hour of trial is referred to, for example, in Revelation 3:10. So he's referring then to the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. And what does he say? No one knows. Not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Sorry, I got a little typo there. Some people question, by the way, why doesn't the Son know? Remember, Jesus is truly God, truly man in one person, and he operates from either nature. Recall that Jesus, a good example of him operating through either nature, is seen when Jesus calmed the sea on the, and when he was in that storm in the boat. I'm sorry, I'm trying to talk as fast as I can to pack as much as I can in this. Remember, Jesus is in the boat with his disciples. They have this huge storm. Jesus is sound asleep in the back of the boat. Why? Because he's truly a man. He's tired. But the next moment he stands up, says, peace be still. He calms the sea. That's something only Yahweh can do according to Job chapter 9. Okay, who alone tramples down the waves of the sea? Well, it's Yahweh. Jesus is Yahweh. Why? Because he can control the storm and the sea. So he's operating from one nature. He's asleep. Then he can operate the next moment from the other nature, his divine nature, and calm the sea. Remember in John chapter 20, Jesus is reinstalling Peter. He asks him 3 times, do you love me, Peter? Feed my sheep. Do you love me, Peter? Feed my sheep. Finally, when he asks him the 3rd time, Peter says, Lord, you know all things. So in Jesus' divine nature, he knows all things. But in his humanity, he doesn't. That's why sometimes he would ask, where have you laid her? Where did you put that person? He asks questions. Okay, and again, he operates through either nature. So here, operating through his humanity, he says, nor the Son. Okay, so again, the idea is that no one knows except God alone, in fact, when the day and the hour will happen. That is the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. And again, Jesus in his divinity, he certainly does know. Okay, so God alone knows. And again, this is just showing you that peri day is indeed the change of a subject. Okay, so yes, we have a change of subject in verse 36, proving Jesus is now handling the first question, when will these things be? Okay, now, why is this so important? Well, I want you to think about if you don't know that there's a change in subject in verse 36, you're going to be completely clueless as to how to read the Olivet Discourse. Let me give you an example. I'm going to put up Matthew 24, verses 34 through 37. So notice I've got this broken into two different paragraphs. Here's verse 34, here's verse 35, here's verse 36, here's verse 37. I just want you to see how I have this structured. Think about, you don't know anything about peri day. So here you're reading about the very end of the 70th week of Daniel. We've just had the concluding battle where Jesus will return, the sun, moon, and stars will be darkened. You have the great ingathering of Israel, a reference to the great trumpet, which is from Isaiah 27:13. And then Jesus gives you the summary. He says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Well, what things? All the things he's written about inside the 70th week of Daniel. That's from Matthew 24:4 all the way to verse 31. Really, then verse 32, he talks about the fig tree analogy, and then he gives you the summary. Notice verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Jesus showing us that, yes, all of his words about the future 70th week of Daniel will in fact come true. Well, then all of a sudden you have peri day. Now he's handling the first question, when? When will these things happen? That is, when is the beginning of the 70th week? So he's talking about, when is the 70th week? All these things take place in Matthew 24, verse 4, all the way to verse 35. You have him talking about the signs inside the 70th week. Does everyone see that on the screen? He's talking about inside. But all of a sudden, verse 36, peri day, now concerning what? Really the beginning of the 70th week. No one knows. Not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. If you don't see this peri day and you have no idea because no prophecy teacher for some reason is telling you on YouTube, well, then you're going to just keep reading this as if this is all just one continuous thought. Okay, so now you're going to be blending the end of the 70th week of Daniel with the beginning. Well, of course it's not going to make any sense. So what we have to know is in Matthew 24, verse 4 through 35, again, verse 35 ends here, it's all about the signs inside the 70th week. When you get to verse 36 all the way to verse 51, you have no signs because it's talking about the beginning of the 70th week. And again, we're dealing with grammar. A syntactical, grammatical construction is telling us that there's been a change in subject. Dear ones, I like math. I was an airline pilot. I was a flight instructor. I like certainty. And one thing I love about grammar and discourse markers like this is it gives you some certainty. And what's so funny is people will argue about this interpretation. They're arguing with grammar. It's like people in the modern day debate about our national debt. When they get angered with people who want to actually reduce spending, they're arguing with math. It's ridiculous. They're arguing with math. Well, here people are, if you don't like this, you're arguing with the grammar. You're arguing with discourse markers that come from the text. Dear ones, what's happened in eschatological discussions is people keep giving you just pablum. They talk about stories and they talk about events and current events and all these things. Well, let's talk about what the text actually says. Are we going to be really reformed? Those who believe that Scripture alone is the final authority, or are we not? Okay, and if we're going to be people who are dedicated to Scripture alone, let's learn how to read the Scriptures. We have to find these things. And by the way, I'll show you some resources in which at the very end you can do some of this research yourself. Okay, and I'll even show you how you can start learning Greek on your own if you want to do that. Okay, our goal here at Gospel of Grace Fellowship, the church that I belong to, is to make every Christian a theologian. That's the goal of the church. The theology can no longer be left to the seminaries. They're a disaster. It has to be given to the average Christian, and that's what I endeavor to do along with my fellow pastor, Bob DeWay. Okay, so that's what I want to show you. So what I've just proven to you now is that indeed there's a distinction between Matthew 24, verses 4 through 35. All the signs are inside the 70th week. When you get to verse 36, now concerning what? The day of the Lord and the hour of trial, that's the 70th week of Daniel, you have no signs. He'll say it 4 or 5 different ways. No one knows. It's like a master who's away from his house on a journey. You don't know when he's coming back. It's like the days of Noah that came suddenly without warning. It's like a thief. A thief doesn't give you precursors. It's all of those things. You have no signs. Okay? Now, if that weren't enough, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that indeed all of the signs are within the Matthew 24 verses 4 through verse 35. But I want to begin here with Matthew 24 verses 4 through 8. And I want to talk about this concept of birth pangs. When Jesus starts giving the signs in Matthew 24, 4 through 35, he begins with false Christ. What's very interesting is that is parallel to the first seal in Revelation chapter 6, verse 1, verses 1 through 2, if I recall. Remember the first seal, you have the Antichrist revealed. Now, here, John, in his letter in the book of Revelation, is focusing on the one, but remember, Jesus here is focusing on the many false Christ. Why is that important? Well, recall in the book of Daniel, there are going to be 10 toes, this 10 kings that will end up giving their allegiance to the one. In other words, at the very beginning of the 70th week of Daniel, there was a battle to be resolved between the 10 kings who were all trying to be Antichrist themselves and the one that they give their allegiance to. In fact, in Revelation 17, you can see that these 10 horns or 10 nations give their allegiance to the one that is the Antichrist. And so there are many false Christs that are vying for power at this time. Jesus focuses on the many. Here John focuses on the one, but they are synonymous. Okay, and I'll show you why this is important. Next sign Jesus talks about is wars, rumors of wars. And many of you will be sitting there thinking, hey, Eric, haven't we always had wars? Yes, we have. We've had them all the way through the church age. But the wars that are being referred to in the opening time period of the 70th week of Daniel are so severe, they function as signs. Very interesting to note at the second seal, in Revelation 6, you have peace removed from the earth. Why? Because you have war. So do you see these are synonymous? Okay, and what that's going to tell us is whatever Jesus is talking about as far as time frame here, it's the same time frame in Revelation chapter 6. What I'll prove to you is because Jesus is obviously talking about the 70th week of Daniel, well, that's obviously the 70th week of Daniel here. Since Jesus is talking about the beginning of it, this is the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel, so is the first and second seal. Okay? That's the parallel I want you to see. Matthew 24:7, there's going to be famines and earthquakes. Lo and behold, third seal, there's famine. Okay, you get to Matthew 24:8, he talks about these being labor pains. How bad are these labor pains? Well, at the fourth seal, due to sword, which is warfare, remember you've had warfare, due to famine, you have famine, right? War, famine. Then you're also going to have pestilence, wild beasts that kill a quarter of the earth. What is being depicted here at the fourth seal, Revelation 6:8, is John is showing the unraveling of the created order. Remember in the initial creation, God gave dominion of man over the beasts of the field. Well, here, because the warfare is so severe, people are opened up to famine. Because the famine and lack of food is so severe, they succumb to disease. Because that's so severe, you're going to have wild beasts that conquer humanity. It won't be uncommon to see a bear dragging a human being down the road, or maybe a raccoon, a baby. That's how severe. And how many people are going to die? A quarter of the Earth's population. That has never occurred in human history. The worst warfare the world has ever seen up until this point has been World War II, where we lost 3% of our population. Here, you're going to lose 25%. That's 8 times worse. So the wars in the opening salvo of Daniel's 70th week, which is in the future, is going to be 8 times worse than what we saw in World War II. That's why Jesus calls them labor pains. The term in Greek there for labor pains is the term odin. If you're to transliterate that into English, it's O-D-I-N. O-D-I-N. Why is that important? Because it's an allusion back to Isaiah 13:8 and the day of the Lord. There in Isaiah 13:8 in the Greek Septuagint, that's the Greek translation of the Old Testament, labor pains is used. Jesus is now showing that we're in the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord begins at what? The beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. So he uses labor pains. Now, who else uses labor pains? Recall, Paul does. The Apostle Paul, who wrote 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians, he takes 30 concepts directly from Jesus' Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and Luke 21, and he uses them in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5. So what? That means that Paul's talking about the same thing Jesus is. Remember, Paul has just talked about the rapture. Now he's talking about the day of the Lord. He says, for you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like what? A thief in the night. While they are saying that they, by the way, are the unregenerate on the earth, they're saying peace and safety, then destruction will come upon them suddenly like what? Labor pains upon a woman with child, and they will not escape. Odin is the same term here, labor pains, that Jesus is using. Why? Because they're talking about the same thing. The day of the Lord comes like labor pains suddenly. Notice here, it also comes like a thief. Okay? It comes like a thief. And there it is, the term thief. I was looking for it. Jesus says the parousia comes like a thief in Matthew 24:43. Okay? All right. So, yes, they're talking about the same time period. The day of the Lord, therefore, must be synonymous with what Jesus is describing. If Jesus is describing the 70th week of Daniel, well, that's the beginning of the day of the Lord. Since Revelation is describing the same events Jesus is, this is the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. This is the beginning of the day of the Lord. Okay? In fact, what I would show, notice on the screen, Revelation chapter 6 through 19 is synonymous with Daniel's 70th week. You have to know that. These are key issues. If you don't put these things together, again, eschatology is never going to make sense to you. Okay? We're putting data together. We're showing these things have to be the same because of the direct allusions in the same language. Okay? Matthew 24, verses 4 through 35 is about the Daniel 70th week. Again, when you get to verse 36, it's about when does it begin? No one knows. So what I want you to see is that in some sense, Revelation chapter 6 through 19 just gives you more details. It's very in-depth. Remember, that was written in 95 AD. Matthew was written earlier. So Revelation is just giving you more information than what Jesus does, but it's the same material, and that's why you're seeing the similarities. Okay, so from Revelation chapter 6 all the way to chapter 19 is Daniel's 70th week. Now, why do we know chapter 19? Because the Lord returns. Read Revelation 19:11 through 21. He's returning. That's the same battle that's depicted in Matthew 24, verses 29 through 31, at the end of the section on the signs inside the 70th week. They're talking about the same thing. Okay? So, hope you put that all together. Now, let me show you then the signs are all found within Matthew 24, verses 4 through 35. I'm going to focus here, though, on verses 4 through 15 because there's so many signs, we have to break them up into numerous slides. Okay, so let's look at the first, again, sign is the false Christ. That's the first one that Jesus gives. Remember, he's answering the second question, what are the signs of your parousia? The parousia is synonymous with the 70th week of Daniel. I've proven that in earlier messages. If you have not seen that, please do so. I don't have time to review it here. So there are going to be false Christs, one, at the very beginning of the parousia. You have 10 nations who end up giving their allegiance to the one. So the many Christs will boil down to the one at the beginning of the parousia. So whether you focus on the many false Christ or the one, that's happening at the beginning of Daniel's 70th week. Here, the 70th week I'm depicting as the first 3.5 years, and then from here to here is the last 3.5 years. So 7 years from here to here, 3.5 from here to here, the midpoint, and from the midpoint to the end, another 3.5. That's the 70th week of Daniel. And every time you see that in my diagrams, that's what I'm referring to. Okay? So again, Jesus is talking about signs not in the church age, okay, but he's showing you them inside the 70th week of Daniel. If you put these signs inside the church age or in 70 AD, you're always going to be wrong. Okay, and you don't want to be wrong. All right, so and I'll prove it to you. Notice here, Matthew 24, 6 through 7, he says wars, famines, and earthquakes. Okay, and again, people say, well, hey, we've always had those things, not in the severity that they're going to have at the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. Again, it's going to lead to a quarter of the earth's death. So Jesus summarizes this as labor pains. The term in Greek is odin. Same term that Paul uses regarding the day of the Lord, 1 Thessalonians 5:3. What can we conclude from that? Well, the day of the Lord begins at the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel, which is synonymous also with the parousia. Okay, so they're used interchangeably. The coming, the day of the Lord, the coming is parousia, the 70th week of Daniel. Okay, so the reason I'm showing you these things is people keep thinking they're different things. They're not. They are synonymous. Okay, then you get to Matthew 24:9. Here Jesus starts to switch to talk about the midpoint. What he's done from Matthew 24:4 all the way to verse 8 is he's taking you from the beginning of the 70th week to the midpoint. Now he starts going to martyrdom, which is from the midpoint to the end. Okay, so he's right at the midpoint. You start seeing martyrdom. This is the Great Tribulation. Matthew 24:10 through 12, lawlessness grows and love grows cold. Many people will turn each other. That happens under the persecution of the Antichrist in the last 3.5 years. You get to verse 13 through 14, the gospel is proclaimed and the end comes. And a lot of people think that the end is the end of the church age. That would be wrong. What he's talking about is that inside the 70th week of Daniel, the gospel will also be proclaimed. In fact, in Revelation 14:6, you have an angel in mid-heaven proclaiming the gospel towards the end of the 70th week of Daniel. Okay, so the end here he's referring to is not the end of the church age. He's referring to the end of the 70th week of Daniel. Now, proof of that is, remember, Matthew 24:4 all the way to verse 8, he brought you from the beginning to the midpoint. So the first 3.5 years are the beginning of labor pains. Okay, now why the labor pains? Well, because the Jews conceived of labor pains being synonymous with the 70th week of Daniel. The 70th week of Daniel would be a 7-year period of labor pains, and what would be birthed would be the Messianic age, where the Messiah reigns. Okay, so think of you and I are living now during the church age. We're in the discomforts of the pregnancy, but we are not inside the birth pains. My wife was pregnant with our boy Will. She was months and months along, and we were laughing it up. We were watching a comedian and hooping and hollering, and all of a sudden her water broke, and labor pains came upon her suddenly. Her pregnancy was like the church age, but as soon as her water broke, which was imminent, it happened suddenly without warning, then it's like being inside the 70th week of Daniel. The labor pains. The labor pains get worse and worse until you have the delivery. The Messiah sets up his kingdom that will be for 1,000 years. What's birthed is the Messianic age. That's the conception. So from Matthew 24:4 through 8, he's just giving you a summary, bringing you from the beginning of the 70th week to the midpoint. From Matthew 24:9 to verse 14, he's bringing you to the end of the 70th week of Daniel. Okay, now how do we know that? Notice here very carefully, Matthew 24:15, by way of recapitulation. What is recapitulation? It's a literary device where the writer goes back, in this case, back to the midpoint, and he talks about the abomination of desolation. Jesus says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, and then he even says, let the reader understand. Okay, in fact, I think he verbally said that. I think that Matthew records that because it's also in Mark. Okay, let the reader understand. So what has he just done? He's brought you back to the midpoint where the Antichrist will set himself up in the temple. You read about that in Daniel 9:27. That's what he's referring to. By the way, the Apostle Paul taught the same thing in 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 4 through 8, where the man of lawlessness sets himself up in the temple, declares himself to be God. What does Paul say destroys the Antichrist? The parousia. Remember, the parousia is the complete 70th week. The parousia, at the very end of the parousia, the Messiah returns with the church and he destroys the Antichrist. You read about that also in Revelation 19:11 through 21. Why? Because that's the end of the 70th week as well. Okay, so again, at verse 15, verse 14 is at the end of the parousia, the 70th week. Verse 15, by recapitulation, he brings you back. Why? Because now he says, when you see the abomination that causes desolation, those who are in Judea are what? To flee to the mountains. Okay, so the people who are alive during this time period, they're going to have to know what to do. They're going to flee to the wilderness. I had an earlier message in my series in eschatology where I proved that God has promised one day he would bring his people into the wilderness, and this time they would believe, whereas they failed to believe the first time in the wilderness. If you read Revelation chapter 12, lo and behold, God brings the Israelites into the wilderness in the 70th week of Daniel for how long? For 3.5 years. For the last 3.5 years. Okay, in the book of Hosea, God promises that one day he'll bring Israel into the wilderness. This time they'll listen. This time they'll come to faith. Think about John the Baptist. Where did he first meet the people of God preparing the way for Messiah? In the wilderness. And yet they didn't believe. So there's going to be a future time in the wilderness. This time, from the 3.5-year mark on, they're going to believe. Okay, so at the midpoint, Jesus just brought you back to the midpoint by way of recapitulation now. Why? Because now he's going to focus on the last 3.5 years all the way to verse 29. I'm sorry, all the way actually to Matthew 24:31, because he'll talk about his actual final battle and return here. Okay, so from Matthew 24:15 all the way to verse 31, he's going to focus at the end, the last 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week, called the Great Tribulation. So let's continue. Matthew 24:16 through 18. Those who are in Judea are to flee to the mountains. You see this also in Revelation chapter 12, where for the last 3.5 years, God brings his people Israel into the wilderness where they come to faith. Paul, let me just bring in one more passage. Paul talks about the salvation of all Israel. He cites Isaiah 59:20. Isaiah 59:20 is about the return of Christ. What happens at the end of the 3.5 years of meeting the Israelites in the wilderness, the Messiah returns, and yes, the kingdom is restored to Israel. Okay, so we're focusing now on the last 3.5 years. Notice here in Matthew 24:19 through 22, to summarize this, Jesus says, upon the world will come such tribulation such as never occurred nor ever will. That's Matthew 24:21. What does that tell us? If it's the worst time period ever, remember, you can't have the worstest. You only have one worst time period. And yes, it's not during the church age. Why? Because during the church age, we've never had 1/3 of the ships being destroyed, 1/3 of the oceans turning to blood, 1/3 of humanity being destroyed by a demonic horde, as we read about in Revelation chapter 8 and 9. Okay, that seems like the worst, and that's exactly what Jesus is describing. So the worst time period is when? It's the 70th week of Daniel. That shows us that all the signs that Jesus has been referring to can't be in the church age. If the church age is the worst time period ever, well, then you'd be supplanting that with the second worst time period ever. In other words, you'd have two worstest. Because the day of the Lord is synonymous with the 70th week of Daniel, that's the worst. So if you put all the signs in the church age, now you have to have the worstest. Are you with me? This can't be the worst because this is the worst. The 70th week of Daniel. Are you with me? What I've just proven to you is, of course, all the signs are in the 70th week. Of course they are. That's why Jesus mentioned the abomination that causes desolation. That's not in the church age. That's in the 70th week of Daniel. Okay, so why do we have prophecy conference after prophecy conference after prophecy conference where people keep bringing up newspaper clippings and saying, well, this is happening here and this? Well, no, it's not. We're not inside the parousia. You would have been raptured. You would have had the display of the man of lawlessness and the whole world giving their allegiance to him if you're in the beginning of the day of the Lord, according to 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 2 through 3. So of course you're not inside the parousia. No matter how bad it gets yet, it's not that bad. Okay? So yes, these are terms that are referring to what's inside the 70th week of Daniel. Matthew 23 through 28, the parousia is obvious. It's like lightning. No one should confuse you that, hey, I think the Messiah already came. No, it's going to be obvious when these things happen. When the parousia of Christ happens, it begins with the rapture of the church. I'll be proving this to you. And then what's going to happen is the wrath of God is poured out, and then Jesus returns with the church to set up his kingdom. In the meantime, in the 70th week of Daniel, you have the worst tribulation ever. The worst trials ever. When is 1/3 of all of the oceans turned to blood? You think if that happened in 70 AD, perhaps Josephus may have mentioned that a time or two. It never happened. Did it ever happen during the church age? Well, of course it didn't. Okay, so the problem with the historist and the preterist and the idealist positions in the book of Revelation is they don't work. The futurist position is the only one that works. It sees Revelation chapter 6 through 19 as being the 70th week of Daniel in the future. Okay, Matthew 24, verse 29, you have the sun, moon, and stars affected. Why? Because now we're at the final battle at the end of the 70th week. Remember, he's taking us from the midpoint now to the end again. And he's referring to the sun, moon, and stars affected, as it were, in Joel 2:31. Why is that important? Because Joel 2:31 segues into Joel 3, which is about the final battle at the end of the 70th week of Daniel, where the nations surround Jerusalem. And God judges them at the valley of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat means Yahweh is judge. And he judges the nations surrounding Jerusalem. That could not have happened in 70 AD. 70 AD is about one nation, Rome, succeeding against Israel. The end battle here in Joel 3 and in Zechariah 14 that will occur at the end of the 70th week, you can read about it in Revelation 19, 11 through 21, is about a battle in which many nations come against Jerusalem and they lose. Why? Because Christ intervenes. These two are not the same thing. Okay, so that's the final battle. Matthew 24:30, the Son of Man appears, clouds of glory. Why? He's returning with his saints to destroy the Antichrist and the forces surrounding Jerusalem and to set up his kingdom. The clouds of glory and the Son of Man are references back to Daniel chapter 7. He is the one who has the right to rule and will reign upon the earth. When you pray the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, you're praying for this event. You're praying that Messiah's rule comes. That's what you're praying for. Okay, so yes, the kingdom is coming to the earth. That's why in Revelation 5:10, the promise from the throne room is they shall reign upon the earth. This is where it's going to happen when he brings his kingdom to Jerusalem and to Israel. Matthew 24:31, you have the ingathering of Israel. Remember, there's a great trumpet. The only time great and trumpet are ever used in the entire Old Testament, Gadol Shafar, is Isaiah 27:13, and it's not the rapture, it's an ingathering of the saints into the kingdom of Israel. Okay, so from verse 29 to 31, it's all about this final battle. Then from verse 32 to 33, the fig tree analogy, when you see all the things in the 70th week of Daniel, if you're living during this time, you'll know to persevere because, yes, the kingdom is going to be here. When you get to verse 34 to 35, this generation will not pass away. Remember, this generation is anyone who's characterized by unbelief and hatred of the promises of God. They will experience this wrath. And Jesus is saying that indeed his word will not fail. That's the point. He gives you that summary. Okay, so what we've seen then from Matthew 24, verse 4, all the way to verse 35, he brings you from the beginning of the parousia, the 70th week of Daniel, to the end. Hope everyone has seen that. These are, again, not signs that are occurring in the church age. If the church age is the worst time period ever, well, then that would be replaced by the day of the Lord, which is the worst time period ever. Therefore, you'd have two worst time periods, and therefore you'd have to have bad grammar. You'd have to say we have the worstest. You can't have the worstest. You only have one worst. This is the worst, right here, the 70th week of Daniel. Matthew 24:15, Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation, where is that? It's at the 70th week of Daniel. Okay, the fundamental error most evangelicals are making are they're throwing all these signs in the church age. That is false. You will always be wrong. How many times will we be wrong in eschatology? You'll always be wrong. Because Jesus isn't talking about the church age. He's talking about the 70th week of Daniel. I've given you lots of evidence for that now. Okay, and how do we know this? Well, we know because now when we get to verse 36, Jesus is going to use peri to talk about the beginning of the 70th week. From Matthew 24:4 all the way to verse 35, he's brought us through the entirety of the 70th week. Okay, so all the signs are in the 70th week of Daniel. What I'm going to start doing now is I'm going to lead you through the text itself. Let me read it to you. Matthew 24:3-8. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Jesus, verse 4, is going to start answering the what question. What are the signs? He's going to do so from verse 4 all the way to verse 35 that I showed you, bringing you from the beginning of the 70th week to the very end. It says, "And Jesus answered and said to them, see to that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many." The revelation of the Antichrist eventually happens here at the 70th week of Daniel. That's what he's referring to. Revelation 6, the first seal. What do you have? The revelation of the Antichrist. Okay, verse 6, he says, "You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end." The end of what? The end of the 70th week. "For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes, but all these things are merely the beginning of what? Labor pains." Odin. Where do labor pains begin? They begin at the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. That's the day of the Lord. Paul says the day of the Lord comes suddenly, like what? Labor pains. Odin, same term. Okay, so that's the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. Remember, Paul said it happens to them suddenly. Could you say it happens suddenly if you're at the end? Well, of course not, because you've seen the worst signs of the worst time period ever. That's not sudden destruction. Paul says it comes suddenly, like sudden destruction, like labor pains. Suddenly is at the beginning of the 70th week, not at the end. Okay, so yes, that's exactly what Jesus is referring to. And again, synonymous with the opening seal judgments of Revelation 6. Okay, keep going. Birth pains. Jesus says, Matthew 24:8, "But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pains." Odin, labor pains. That's the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. Again, the church age is the discomforts of the pregnancy, but here comes the labor pains. And what's going to be birthed at the end is the Messianic kingdom. Okay, so the 70th week of Daniel are the birth pangs. We see the same allusion here, 1 Thessalonians 5:2-3. Paul says, "For you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord," what's the day of the Lord? That's the 70th week of Daniel, "will come just like a thief in the night. It comes without warning." While they're saying peace and safety, then sudden destruction will come upon them, destruction will come upon them suddenly, like what? Labor pains. Again, same term that Jesus used. That's Odin. Okay, "upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape." Who's the they? It's the unregenerate who are on the earth. Okay? All right, so I want to make those connections. Now, Jesus covers the last half. Let's get to verse 9. Okay, now we're at the midpoint. "Then they will deliver you to tribulation, and they will kill you, and you'll be hated by all nations." That's because Antichrist is reigning now. And he says, "They'll hate you because of my name. At that time, many will fall away, betray one another, and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. The end of what? The end of the 70th week of Daniel. Verse 14, this is the gospel of the kingdom that shall be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end comes. The end of what? The 70th week of Daniel. Remember, in Revelation chapter 14, verse 6, God even uses an angel in mid-heaven who proclaims the gospel to all the nations. When does that happen? In the last 3.5 years of the 70th week of Daniel. We get to verse 15. By way of recapitulation now, Jesus brings you back to the midpoint. Okay, recapitulation means to go back and then focus again. At verse 15, he says, when you see the abomination of desolation, which is spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. What's the holy place? It's the temple. It's the man of lawlessness is going to put himself up in the temple, just as Daniel 9:27 describes, and just as Paul describes in 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 4 through 8. That's what Paul was referring to, and this is what Jesus is referring to. So obviously we're in the 70th week of Daniel. That should prove it to you. We're not in the church age prior. We're in the 70th week of Daniel. Now from verse 16 to all the way to verse 31, he's going to bring you to the end of the 70th week of Daniel. Okay? Verse 26, then those who are in Judea, when they see the abomination of desolation at the midpoint, what do they do? Flee to the mountains. Notice how Israel-centric this is. What should you do if you're in the Rocky Mountains? Should you flee to the Rocky Mountains? Well, no, it doesn't say that. If you're in Judea, you have to flee to the mountains. But if you're in Minnesota, should you flee to Buck Hill? No, it's Israel-centric. That doesn't mean it doesn't apply to us, the church. It certainly does, because we're seeing that God is faithful to his promises. This kingdom that's coming after the parousia and the millennial kingdom, that's our kingdom. That's our kingdom. I was grafted in the moment I believed, and so were you. If you're a Gentile, the moment you believed in Jesus Christ, you're grafted in to this kingdom that's coming to Israel. That's the point. So yes, of course this applies. But for those who are living during this time period, they need to know what to do in order to survive. Okay, notice he says, verse 17, whoever's on the housetop must not go down to get the things out of their house. Whoever's in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. Stop there. Does Sabbath matter in most nations? No, but it does in Israel. They shut down on Saturday. I've been there. In Jerusalem, you try to go to a store, you're not going to find anything. It's shut down. It's Sabbath. Notice he says, verse 21, he says, for then there will be what? Great tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Does everyone realize verse 21 is saying this is the worst time period ever? Notice, never will it ever be that bad again. Okay, so think about this. If that's happening during the church age, think about verse 21, the absurdity. If that's the worst time period ever, and yet the day of the Lord here is the worst time period ever, now you have two worst time periods. You have the worstest. Here's the worst and here's the worstest. Well, that doesn't make any sense. There's only one worst. And obviously it's the 70th week of Daniel. That's why Jesus said when you see the abomination that causes desolation. So it's the 70th week of Daniel. That's the worst time period ever. In fact, Jesus says, verse 22, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Now, those days are cut short to what? The 7 years total, or 3.5 at the end. So there's going to be a total of 7 years. They're cut short to that. Later, that'll become important when we start debating pre-wrath versus pre-trib. Pre-wrath proponents of the rapture assume that the 70th week of Daniel is going to be less than that. I'm going to show you that I think that's a direct contradiction to Scripture. Okay? We'll talk about that later. Let's keep moving. We get to Matthew 24, verses 23 through 28. Jesus says, then if anyone says to you, behold, there is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I've told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the parousia, the coming of the Son of Man, be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Jesus saying his return is unmistakable. During the 70th week of Daniel, people will be led astray. It shouldn't happen. Why? Because when he returns in power and glory to destroy the enemy surrounding Jerusalem, it's going to be obvious. Okay? Now, from there, let's get to the very end of the 70th week. He's brought us from Matthew 24:15 all the way now to the end point in Matthew 24:29 through 31. Notice he says, but immediately after the tribulation of those days. Stop there. Let's just stop there. When Jesus says, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, Many Christians are falsely saying that's the end of the church age. They're putting those days as being the church age. If you do that, you're always going to be wrong. What time period has Jesus been referring to? The 70th week of Daniel. If you're a preterist, partial preterist, full preterist, and you say, well, those days are 70 AD, you're always going to be wrong. Was 70 AD the worst time period ever? Really? When did a third of all the oceans turn to blood in 70 AD? Well, of course it didn't happen. That's not the worst time period. The church age, did it happen then? Well, of course not. That's not the worst time period. The worst time period is in the 70th week of Daniel. So when he says immediately after the tribulation of those days, he's at the end of the 70th week. What's going to happen? The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky. What's he referring to? Joel 2:31. Direct allusion. Direct allusion to it. Direct allusion. Why? Because Joel chapter 2:31 blends into Joel chapter 3, which is about the final battle where all the nations are going to come against Jerusalem. God judges them there at the valley of Jehoshaphat, the valley where Yahweh shall fate. Yahweh is judge. That's what he's going to do. That's what Jesus is describing. Notice it says the powers of the heavens will be shaken. These are cosmic disturbances. Now the greatest sign. Remember, Jesus has given you sign after sign after sign after sign in the 70th week, but now you come to the sign. Verse 30, then the sign of the Son of Man. That's an allusion to Daniel chapter 7. The Messiah is known as the Son of Man. He's going to appear in the sky. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming in what? The clouds of the sky. There's again a reference. If I recall, it's Daniel 7:13. I think that's the reference right there. It's in Daniel 7. Okay, then verse 31, it says, and he will send forth his angels with a what? A great trumpet. Stop there. Exceedingly important. What is great trumpet? Jot this down, Isaiah 27:13. The only passage in the entire Hebrew scriptures that puts gadol, great, and shofar, trumpet together is Isaiah 27:13. If you read Isaiah 27, you know what it's about? It's about the ingathering of Israel into their kingdom. That's the idea of the term gather. Okay, notice where it says he will gather together. That term is aposynagoge. You've heard kind of the root here. You can hear it of synagogue, to gather. Okay, aposynagoge is used of Jesus gathering the Jews into their kingdom, the Israelites. How do I know that? Because Jesus said in Matthew 23, verse 37, O Israel, or I'm sorry, O Jerusalem, how I long to gather you, aposynagoge, same term that's used here, as a hen would gather her chicks, but you would not have it. All over the New Testament, it's used of the ingathering of the Israelites. Okay, that's how it's being used. So this isn't the rapture. This is the ingathering of the Israelites and all the saints, what? Into the kingdom that he's now establishing in Israel. That's what he's referring to. So he's brought you from the beginning to the end. Now, what happens? You have the big shift using peri day. We don't have it yet, though. Verses 32 to 35 are at the end of the 70th week. He says, now learn the parable from the fig tree. Just as you know, when the fig tree has tender and put forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, all what things? All the things inside the 70th week, if you're living then, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly say, this generation, again, that's a pejorative, will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Remember, this generation is not a time period, it's a pejorative. No matter what time you believe, what time period you live in, if you're an unbeliever, all the wrath will come upon you. You're part of this generation. Jesus is saying that heaven and earth will pass away, but his words never will. It's a certainty that these things will come about. That's great comfort to us that we know Jesus is faithful to his word. Okay, now, verse 36, here's peri day. Jesus has just finished answering the second question, what are the signs of your coming and the end of the age? Remember, it's synonymous. What are the signs of your coming? He just gave you them. So he went from the beginning to the end of the 70th week of Daniel, but now he's going to start answering the first question, when will these things be? And here the NASB renders it but of, but it's best rendered now concerning. That's peri day. Now concerning that day and hour. He's talking about the beginning of the 70th week. What? No one knows. Not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the parousia, remember the parousia is the whole 70th week. The parousia of the Son of Man will be just like what? The days of Noah. What happened in the days of Noah? They had no idea destruction was coming upon them. It came suddenly. Notice that's exactly Jesus' point. Matthew 24:38 through 41, he says, for as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. Verse 39, they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the parousia of the Son of Man be. Verse 40, then there will be 2 men in the field. One will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and one will be left. Verse 40 is a rapture passage. Notice it's connected to the days of Noah. Just as the days of Noah came suddenly, where Noah and his family were removed, notice they entered the ark. Then what happened? Well, then the wrath came and destroyed the unregenerate. In the same way, verse 40 is the rapture. Why? Because now we're talking about the beginning of the 70th week. Remember the peri day, Matthew 24:36. So now we're talking about the rapture. Then there will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken. The term taken is paralambano. It's the same term Jesus used in John 14:3. If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again. And paralambano, same term it's used here, I will receive you to myself so that where I am, there you may be also. This is a rapture passage. This is a rapture passage. They're both using paralambano. Some people claim it's the people who are left that are saved. Well, that's interesting because the term left there, aphami, is used for the abandonment of the temple 1 chapter earlier. Matthew 23:38, Jesus, hot under the collar, excoriates the Jewish leadership. He says to them as he leaves their temple, behold, your house is being left, aphami, to you desolate. In the upper room, Jesus promises that he would never, aphami, abandon us as orphans. This term aphami is not appropriate for the usage of believers, since 1 chapter earlier it's used for the abandonment of the Jerusalem temple to destruction. Is that a term Matthew is going to use for believers 1 chapter later? I think not. Again, there's going to be 2 women grinding at the mill. One will be taken, paralambano, received, the same term is used here. Same term it's used here. The one that's going to be left is aphami. They're abandoned to judgment, just like the temple. Germans, think about it. The English reader says, well, wait a minute. The flood came and took the bad guys away, the unbeliever. So taken and taken must be the same idea. No, took here is arrow. But taken here is paralambano. They're 2 different terms. If Matthew wanted you to think that took and taken were the same, he would have used arrow and arrow. But instead he uses arrow, then paralambano. Why? Because remember, the took here, the flood came and took them all away, the bad people in Noah's day, the unbeliever. But Noah had already entered the ark. He already had been taken away in that sense. Okay, so Noah entering the ark is like the one that is taken. The one that the flood came and took them away, they were abandoned, left to judgment of the flood. Okay, so certainly the one who's taken is the one who's taken in salvation. That's a rapture passage. Why is it put in verse 40? Because that's the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. Remember, Matthew 24:36, if you don't see peri day, you're going to be out in left field. He's just switched topics. He's now saying, when does the 70th week begin? No one knows. He said that in verse 36. Verse 37, it's like the days of Noah. Verse 38, what happened in the days of Noah? Well, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage. The point isn't sinful. Is it sinful to engage in marriage? No. Paul says, in fact, in 1 Timothy chapter 4, that anyone who prohibits marriage is teaching a doctrine of demons. If you prohibit marriage, you're teaching what? A doctrine of demons. Is it therefore sinful to marry? Of course not. If you prohibit marriage, you're teaching a doctrine of demons, but not if you're getting married. So it's not married to get married. It's not sinful to marry. It's not sinful to drink or eat. Why? All foods are clean. Jesus declared that in Mark chapter 7. All right? So it's not evil to eat, drink, or to get married. All right? So what Jesus is describing is life as it always went on. Why is that fitting? Because the 70th week of Daniel, the beginning of it, is life as it always was. But after the 70th week of Daniel, it's not life as it always was. Because you have the worst time period ever. Brothers and sisters, let's learn to read. Let's learn to read these scriptures for all they're worth. Let's look at the discourse markers. Let's look at the context. All the signs are in Matthew 24, verses 4 through 35. Now, we don't have one sign. Now we're just talking about when these things will occur. No one knows. He's giving us the rapture at the very beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. Do thieves give precursors? Well, of course they don't. Matthew 24, verses 42 through 43. Now, Jesus says, therefore, be on the alert, gregareo. Same term Paul uses in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse, I've got it in my notes here, verse 6. Be on the alert, gregareo. How are you on the alert? You're found in the faith. If you trust in Jesus Christ, you're on the alert. And you're living accordingly. The idea is if you really have faith, you you really act on it. Okay, that's being on the alert. For you do not know what? Which day your Lord is coming. Notice there's no signs. He's talking about the beginning of the 70th week. Remember, Matthew 24, verse 4, all the way to verse 35, we had all the signs. Verse 36, all of a sudden, when is the beginning of the 70th week? No one knows. Now he's saying, therefore, be on the alert, gregareo, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. He's talking about the beginning. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at the time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert, gregareo, and would have not allowed his house to be broken into. The beginning of the 70th week comes like what? A thief. Remember, the term kleptes is a thief that uses stealth. That's what they use. Okay? So you have no idea. It's like a thief that comes. Again, Matthew 24, 4 through 35, all the signs were here. But now we're in Matthew 24, 36 through 51. Remember, that's the section we're in. And there's no signs as to the beginning of this rascal. You have no idea. It's like a thief. That's why Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5:2, the day of the Lord comes like a thief. He's talking about the beginning of the 70th week there as well. Remember, Paul, 1 Thessalonians 5:2 says the day of the Lord comes like a thief. 3 verses earlier, what was he talking about in 1 Thessalonians 4:17? He's talking about the rapture. The rapture comes, the day of the Lord comes then. That's the idea. This is exactly what Jesus is teaching in the Olivet Discourse. You just have to know the chiastic structure using peri. Okay? So, be on the alert. That's gregareo. Again, being found in the faith. If you're a believer in Jesus Christ, you don't know when he's coming, but you believe that he's coming. That's what makes you different from the unbeliever. The unbeliever doesn't know when he's coming, but they don't believe that he's coming. So you and I aren't different than the unbeliever because we know when he's coming. No one knows. Not even the angels of heaven. Right? That's what Jesus said in Matthew 24:36. So you don't know, I don't know, no unbeliever knows. No one knows. What differentiates the believer from the unbeliever is not we know when he's coming, but we believe that he's coming. So we are prepared for whenever the 70th week rascal breaks forth, the rapture and the ensuing day of the Lord wrath. That's the idea. Okay, let's keep going. We're almost done. Matthew 24, 44 through 49. For this reason, you also must be ready. For the Son of Man, remember that's messianic, Daniel 7, is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of the household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, my master is not coming for a long time, and begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with the drunkards, etc., there's going to be bad things that happen. Notice he says he must be ready, the person who's a believer, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think. Right? He's like a master who's away from his household. So again, the point is there's no signs Jesus is talking about. He's talking about the beginning of the 70th week. You don't have any idea. It's like a master who's away from his home. That's Jesus. And you and I are working for the master. And the idea is if we really believe, we're going to be about his business. If we don't believe, we'll be sinning it up. That's the idea. So gregareo, the idea of being on alert, being ready, means to be found in the faith, really trusting in Jesus Christ, and therefore obedient to him. So you're ready for whenever he returns. Because you don't know. You have no idea. It could be tonight, the rapture. It could be next week, 100 years from now. You have no idea. It's imminent. It's at hand, the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. You never know. Okay? Now, finally, verse 50 through 51, it says, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, at an hour which he does not know. And he will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Brothers and sisters, we have no idea when the 70th week of Daniel is coming. Once you're inside the 70th week, you have all sorts of signs. But in Matthew 24:36, all the way here to verse 51, notice there wasn't one sign. Not one. Why? Because he's talking about the beginning of the 70th week. The context and the grammar shows us that Jesus is answering the first question last from Matthew 24:36 all the way to verse 51. He's talking about when does the 70th week come? We have no idea. 4 or 5 different ways he's just showed you have no idea. It's like a master who's away, and the slave, that's you and I, don't know when he's coming. That's the idea. And if we act in a way where we're obviously in unbelief, if we're not believers, what's going to happen to us? We're going to be finding the place of the weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's the ultimate wrath of God that comes later in the lake of fire. Okay, so the point is, we want to be those who are found in the faith, and be those who trust upon Jesus Christ. Why? Because then whenever the 70th week of Daniel comes, we're ready. We're ready. So today, if you've not believed in Jesus Christ, today is the day to repent and to believe upon Jesus Christ, have your sins forgiven, and be ready for any time that the day of the Lord may come. That's the message from the Olivet Discourse. Brothers and sisters, I hope you understand this chiastic structure. I hope you review it, you understand it, you memorize it, get it down, because again, it is the key to understanding eschatology. We'll see you next time, End Times with Pastor Eric.